All right, guys, I'm gonna start us off here. We want to thank you for joining Maysles Documentary Center's virtual Mossville Q&A. My name's Allison Lights, and I'm the theater manager and programmer here at the cinema. Normally, we screen documentaries all year round and have education programs for youth in Harlem and the South Bronx, but obviously we're virtual right now. Our education programs and our cinema, as you've seen, has been able to continue virtually, which we're incredibly grateful for. We have a lot of virtual screenings planned and coming up. Currently, we have a series that opened yesterday called Le Jolie Maysles, which includes films inspired by the classic film Le Jolie May. We also have Spaceship Earth available right now and a series by Shoga Films coming up called the Queer Harlem Renaissance, and that'll be live next week. For more information about those films, you can check out our website, maysles.org, and also remember to sign up for a newsletter while you're there for more updates. We can't wait to have you back in the cinema with us, but in the meantime, as always, are incredibly grateful for your support. With us today are Michelle Lanier, the executive producer of Mossville. She is a self-described documentary doula, which I love, and a faculty at the Center for Documentary Studies at Duke University. We also have Alex Glustrom, and correct me if I'm saying that wrong, Alex, I'm sorry. He's the director and editor for Mossville and an award-winning filmmaker and cinematographer for HBO, New York Times, CNN, and his previous film was called Big Charity, a documentary about the death of America's oldest hospital. We also have Monique Harden, who's a lawyer and a subject in the film. She is the Community Engagement Program Manager at the Deep South Center for Environmental Justice. Thank you guys for being with us today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I want to start with sort of a basic question, but for Alex and Michelle, maybe, how you came to the story of Mossville in particular and why?
Well, I came to Mossville thanks to Monique Harden, who's on this call. She, her and I were on a panel after my first film, Big Charity, and you know I'd known who Monique was, and we met when I was filming Big Charity, and she's a really well-respected and amazing leader in the environmental justice space in Louisiana. And she came up to me after the panel and was like, "You should go to this place, Mossville. This might be your next film." And so I trusted her and went out there, and yeah, here we are a few years later, and it's coming out. So thanks to Monique.
So then I guess I'll reroute my question. Monique, were you involved in it in Mossville in some other way, or how did you?
Yeah, so I first came to Mossville in 1996, and I'll never forget the day driving in by myself and to the community and seeing these towering oil refineries and chemical facilities, all with these flanked on the fences with these banners that says how many clean days and how many safe days and their commitment to safety. And in the midst of all of this giant storage tanks and smokestacks are modest homes where African Americans have lived for more than 100 years. Above the roadways, you have this large rack of pipes moving chemicals overhead, and then you've got along the streets of Mossville, but waist-high pipes letting you know that underground there are chemicals swishing around. And these industries have just built around this historic African-American community as though it never existed. It was invisible. And it just was such a painful, crushing thing to just see and just seeing this injustice and these banners around safety. And it was, and then meeting the folks in Mossville, boy, tremendous. What I would tell people about Mossville residents that each one deserves their own TV show. Just very brilliant, incredible, loving, spiritual people who wanted nothing more than a safe place to live and to raise their families. And since 1996, and certainly long before, Mossville was seeing a situation where people on their own were leaving because it was unsafe to be in the community. And for those who were able to find ways or opportunities to leave, they did. But so you wound up with a larger elder senior citizens who were still holding on to their communities and having just a deep abiding commitment to how it's a part of who they are and their heritage. And can remember as children when the roads were cut and their fathers and grandfathers and grandmothers built the homes that they're living in today. And then organizing themselves as Mossville Environmental Action Now to fight against the sin of environmental racism with these polluting facilities in their midst. So I wanted Alex, because if you saw Big Charity, you see a director who's very sensitive to ways in which health and lives, as important as that is, how diminished it is in decision making, for, in this case, hospitals after Hurricane Katrina. And I really wanted him to come to Mossville and see what was happening and to make a documentary around it so that their story could reach other people around the world.
Thank you.
And I think you did a fine job. Thank you, Alex.
Thank you.
Michelle, had you worked with Alex prior, or how did you get involved in the film?
Yes, I have worked with Alex previously. I, as you mentioned, have been teaching at the Center for Documentary Studies at Duke University for 20 years now. And I was very proud to say that I teach documentary ethics, but I'm not a filmmaker, because at the Center for Documentary Studies, we were always emphasizing kind of multi-genre documentary meaning making. So from audio to archival to writing, documentary writing, and documentary photography, and even beyond that, documentary murals and documentary music, documentary poetry. So we were and are still very committed to experimental documentary work. So I no longer can say I'm not a filmmaker, but the person who had really, the person I kind of blame, so to speak, for getting me into the film world is a former student who is also a producer on the film. Her name is Catherine Ryerson, and Catherine was a producer on Big Charity. So long story short, after a week-long intensive institute that I led, Catherine said, I would love for you to look at this rough cut of this film, Big Charity, that I'm working on. And I said, no, we've gone through, almost 8-hour days for, 6 days. I'm not going to review a rough cut. And she was just really persistent. I was also nervous, what if it's not good? How do you give that kind of feedback? And then I kept saying no. She kept persisting. I kept saying no. A thunderstorm broke out. Huge North Carolina thunderstorm. And I said, I don't think we're driving anywhere in this. We got to do something with our time. I'll watch this rough cut. And it was amazing. It took my breath away. Amazing cinematography, beautiful painterly views, heartbreaking story that really had me thinking and excited to be involved. And I couldn't help but take notes. And so Catherine took those notes back to Alex, and Alex said, these are great notes. We got to get Michelle out here. And I thought, I'm not a producer. So went out there for like a Labor Day weekend. We workshopped not only the film, but how the team was working together. What are the internal ethics? What are the ethics of representation? Whose stories are being told? What's the impetus? What baggage and biases are people bringing to the story? And I thought, this is not just normal production work. I feel like I'm being a doula. I'm helping them to birth this film. And that was the birth of my identity of documentary doula. And so when Alex called me later and said, we're working on another project, Mossville, and we think we need your advisement, I said, I would love to offer advisement. I'd started a big career shift. I oversee 25 museums in North Carolina. And I said, I'll do what I can. What started as advisement and kind of giving some consultation to the team and helping them to think about what are the racial ethics of the film. Again, checking our biases, checking on whose story is being told by whom, That reality, that role shifted from more of a consultant or an advisor, documentary doula, to an executive producer. So I'm really proud that this is my first executive producer credit.
It's amazing. So my next question was how you found the characters, and I'm wondering kind of how each of you played into finding these different subjects that are in the film. Obviously, Stacey Ryan is the sort of protagonist, but there's also different people who are featured.
Yeah, well, when I went out to Mossville for the first time, there were a number of residents who were waiting to greet me, and they began telling me their stories and introducing me to people. At the time, I wasn't sure whether it would be a feature-length documentary film. I think my first instinct was that we were just going to make a piece that Monique and the Mossville residents could use for advocacy, maybe a short-form piece. And then I met Stacey, and I think once I met Stacey and saw his situation, that's when I realized that he would be a really powerful character to tell a full feature-length story. Stacey, his personality kind of has a lot of the things that I think make for great storytellers. You know, he's a very deep, emotional person. He's in touch with himself and his emotions, and he's willing to be vulnerable. He's very honest and determined. He's also very charismatic, and you know, he carries a lot of heaviness with him, but he also is very lighthearted, and he's fun to be around. And I think also in a lot of ways we talk about how Stacey's story is a reflection of the greater story of Mossville in a unique way, which is that Mossville, a lot of the residents talk about Mossville's founding by their ancestors as a form of activism in and of itself. This idea of just existing as a form of resistance and just wanting to be left alone and be self-sufficient and isolated. And obviously those are things that are very much reflected in Stacey's struggle. He just wants to exist and he just wants to be. And that's something that we thought would make for a good micro story that has the macro story of Mossville as a part of it.
Did you find that people were like open to, like there's a lot of sort of, you know, pictures of their grandfathers and sort of some of the founding members, Mr. Fisher, I know was in there, like photos of different people. Were people pretty open to sharing their lives with you, or?
Yeah, they were. I mean, there were a lot of people who we filmed with who we decided didn't fit in the final narrative, but there were a lot of people who wanted to participate. But I do think there was something unique about Stacey in the level of his eagerness to participate. You know, we would film with some people, we'd film with them for a day, and then they'd be like, okay, like, get out of my house now. Like, I filmed with you and I've done enough. Where Stacey was like, come back tomorrow and come back the next day and come back next week. Stacey really, really wanted his story to be told. And I think that was another reason why we felt like he would be a good main character.
Michelle, you mentioned that you had played a role in sort of crafting how people were, or just like discussions around like ethics of representation. Do you have some examples of what that entailed?
Sure. I have to say that everyone involved in this film is very much aware that there is a growing outcry in the field of documentary work, a kind of rising up against really colonial practices and extractive practices where people who are from outside a community come in and extract narratives and make a name for themselves, or attempt to, maybe money, maybe build a career, maybe build relationships that propel them to a place, but maybe not propel that community or the other subject matters to any sort of place that they're trying to get to. I think even worse, it has no sort of connectivity to the people that are being represented as stakeholders in the story. And this kind of collaborative storytelling, this seeking consent around the narrative is not appropriate for every kind of documentary film. Certainly if you're doing an expose on corporate, malpractice, you're not going to go to that corporation and say, we want to make sure you feel good about how you look. But I do think for traditionally marginalized people who have been used and in many ways abused by, scholars, filmmakers, and journalists, there is this outcry, to stand up against that. The people living with disabilities, activists have a phrase, nothing about us without us. And that's something that I think about a lot when it comes to telling stories of traditionally marginalized people. And so it meant a lot for me as a woman of color from the South, as a Black woman from the South, to be asked to be a part of this team that's telling the story about a Black Southern community. But it also, we agreed as a team that it meant even more to have a producer from Mossville, who's not on this panel, but has been on many panels, and I think he's on one later on today, Daniel Bennett. He's actually from Mossville, multi-generational Mossvillian, and not just kind of a token Mossvillian to throw into the producer mix, but also someone very interested in film and who is a photographer himself, who had creative control in many ways and really is a connector for us, continues to be a connector. So much so, another example is that obviously, Stacey's health is very vulnerable. There were many times that we were concerned that he would not live to see the premiere of the film. We are really grateful that he is still among the living. Many people of Mossville have not been able to survive the chemical exposure of the petrochemical plants. But Stacey's tired. He still fights, but he's tired. And he has spiritually and intellectually passed of the baton. He has blessed Daniel to carry on some of his fight with this film. So those are some of the conversations that we've been having, some of the dynamics that have shown up, even in terms of reciprocity as income comes in for the film, a percentage of all proceeds around ticket sales, the broadcast deal that we have with PBS, a percentage will go back to family members of Mossville, of the Mossville community.
Amazing. We've had a few people join us in the Q&A, and I just want to say, if you guys are interested, please feel free to write into the Q&A chat box with any questions that you guys have for the wonderful panelists we have today. While you guys are thinking about that, I have another question. Monique, in the film, I believe it's you who say this community has become transformed as a result of governmental approvals for their community. I'm wondering how either gerrymandering or just elections in general have played a role in atrocities like what's happening in Mossville right now. And I'm wondering, on a more positive side, if you see any hope in situations like this, sort of across the board, maybe outside of Mossville as well, or if this is just something that we're still very much muddling through and in the middle of.
Well, I think part of the trick of being an audience or a person looking at a film is that you may not see yourself in the film. And the fact that we're having this conversation not in person where I can shake your hand, give you a New Orleans hug or anything like that is a sign of how race and health work and decisions, even with this, obviously we're seeing it in very brutal, tragic ways with the COVID-19 pandemic we're all under. And those same things are there. Mossville could not happen without those same societal drivers. I think what Michelle was talking about in terms of this evolution around documentary filmmaking to be more human, more people-centered and ethical is aligned very much with the environmental justice movement, which is around basic human rights of self-determination that everyone has, the right to freedom from racial discrimination, the right to health, the right to security in your home, and that self-determination and a family life are all part of the very things that were snatched away from Mossville and is being snatched away from so many of us in this COVID-19 pandemic. In terms of things like, the specific political or legal tools that can be used to trap a community like Mossville in a situation like this. It began, and we talk about this in the human rights petition that Mossville Environmental Action Now, the group of Mossville residents, filed with the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights of the Organization of American States. And the petition was, we were able to overcome objections by government attorneys during the Bush administration and the Obama administration to be able to have the commission actually take jurisdiction over what was the first case of environmental racism in the United States as a human rights violation. So when we're talking about this, we're talking about basic human rights not being respected. And in some ways it's part of the structure of our government, so that when those industrial facilities began coming into Mossville in the 1940s, it was done at a time when the residents themselves could not vote as individuals, right? Because we had Jim Crow laws and voting was unlawful for Black folks in the South, by and large. They also, although Mossville is, they've organized it as a community, it's an informal community. It was never incorporated so that there would be this governmental setup for mayor and taxes and systems of governance that folks and people in cities or counties may recognize. But they, and so therefore the decisions, they had no decision-making control as a collective around what would develop, what would be built in their community. And so all those decisions were made at the state level of government and the federal levels of government. And those decisions were allowing this industrial poisoning of Mossville to happen without regard to those clear health, community, devastating effects of that, to the point where the community is had lost an entire section of itself prior to the Sasol development that's depicted in the film. So I think some of the things for me is your question is really helpful in terms of asking all of us to think about what is it that can allow a company like Sasol to thrive in Mossville, in the United States of America? What is it about our country that doesn't protect people and doesn't protect our communities? And it's really in the ways in which voting is denied, the right to be self-determined and to be able to participate in governmental decision-making is really taken away from a community like Mossville. And there's so many other communities across the board, and we're seeing that in the course of this pandemic, air pollution increases the risk of hospitalizations and death for folks who are infected with the COVID-19 disease. And that's in particular predominantly African-American Black communities. And we're seeing that here in Louisiana, where I am, in New Orleans, where Mossville is located, and in other parts of the country. So those political dynamics can really have life and death consequences at the end of it. You know, that dry, boring, technical air pollution law or regulation can mean that your community may or may not survive. That's real.
Yeah, very much. We're seeing that, as you said. I was really particularly struck by the governor so blatantly sort of posing it as like, this is economic development, and really like putting this like spin on it where you think, if you're just kind of not thinking it through critically and watching it like, wow, this is great, you know, money coming in. And just as you said earlier, like the disconnect between health and lives and economic development.
And let's be clear, it's not economic development. Most of the money that Sasol was given was through very poor Louisiana taxpayers, millions and millions of dollars. And where's our state with all of this industry we have? We have tons of oil, Exxon, Shell, they're all here. And we're 49th, 50th in the country when it comes to economic prosperity of residents. So the companies take, and there's this PR message around economic development hasn't panned out in the years and generations that they've been in operation in the state. In fact, just the opposite. It's actually made our state poorer and sicker as a result.
Are there laws right now that you're seeing taking, I mean, I know that there's been sort of, as this whole pandemic is taking place, there's been a lot of repealing of EPA laws in particular, or of environmental protection laws. And I'm wondering if there's ones in particular that we can sort of keep an eye on and look for that you are particularly.
Well, yeah, so the problem that we have is that the laws that EPA is deciding not to enforce during this pandemic, which makes no sense. It's, if anything, you should be doing more to enforce and ensure that these laws are followed. Don't do enough to actually ensure health outcomes. Those laws are basically maintaining the status quo of industrial operations, but we give it these fancy names like Clean Air Act and Clean Water Act. And what they boil down to is allowing an oil refinery to act like other oil refineries, or a chemical company to act like other chemical companies. And that act is laid out in what's called an environmental permit. And when people complain about health or noxious odors or children with nosebleeds or asthma or cancer, the companies and the governmental officials say, oh, well, it's operating within the permit. Well, the permit is not designed to protect communities, as clearly shown in this documentary. Mossville should be the healthiest community in the world if these environmental laws were what they were to be, as well as the richest community if the economic development promises came to fruition. So I think part of the challenge is being clear about the work is not just preventing EPA or working to fight against EPA's rollback of existing laws, but really the fight is, how do we get the laws to marry environmental justice? How do we get the laws to really protect human health and communities? And that's really where the struggle is. And so so we should never lose sight of that fight. It's really for environmental justice. It's really for those human rights underpinnings that make environmental justice movement demands what they are.
As you said, I believe it was Miss Jackson in the film who said, we were safe here in Mossville, we were free, you were free. And that line really struck me, especially given that she was talking about African-American residents over 100 years ago, at a point when that was not really the case in many parts of the US. And I'm not sure, this comes from I was listening to Malcolm Gladwell's revisionist history episode on just like the ways in which he did one on the Brown versus Board of Education, and how like desegregation was sort of framed in a very different way to the public than in the realities of the outcomes of it, and how segregation at the time was actually had many more benefits in some ways in terms of role models, and there actually being many more Black teachers than there are even today for Black students, and in that way. So I'm wondering what you took away from the making of this film about the end of segregation and how that has affected Black communities across this country, but specifically like around, specifically to Mossville, I guess, in that way.
Yeah,
I mean,
I'll speak a little bit to that. I'm sure Monique would have something to say as well. I'm very fascinated with what I call the Afro South, and have spent a career in terms of my public humanities work, doing a lot of retelling of narratives around what I call oasis spaces, Black oasis spaces. I graduated from an HBCU. I went a historically Black college or university, went to Spelman College. I am a descendant of people who went to the oldest historically Black university in the South, Shaw University in Raleigh, where SNCC was born, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, under the leadership of Ella Baker, who's called the godmother of the civil rights movement. I come from at least 5 generations of Black teachers who taught primarily in Black spaces. I have stories of my grandmother accompanying a cousin into a rural part of North Carolina and sleeping in a chicken coop while they built a one-room schoolhouse. My grandfather helped to get the first Black high school started, public high school started in Raleigh, North Carolina. So Black spaces are really important to me. I do think we need to tell a new story of this Black South. That's why I wear it on my body. I live it in my life. I think the story of victimhood, a story of just cross it, we have an image of a cross being burned in the film. And I remember editorially saying, Alex, let's not let it linger too long, because that's not the story of Mossville. This is a story of self-determination. It's a story of a Black oasis space. This is a story of Black community in the South thriving until they are encroached by these petrochemical plants. It's the story of Zora Neale Hurston's, Eatonville, Florida. It's the story of Princeville, North Carolina, the oldest incorporated Black town in the country. Look it up, Freedom Hill. These stories need to be told. So I think where my passion is, let's not throw out the baby with the bathwater. I think these pendulum swings have been dangerous for our nation. I think even King in some of his later writings realized, that in advocating so much for this, for desegregation in the ways in which they manifested, no one realized what that did to Black towns, what it did to Black Wall Streets, what it did to schools where you had teachers who lived in your community, loved you, cared about you. Now, I believe in access and choice, and I want to be able to shop and eat and ride on, public transportation in the ways that I would like to. But I also think that there's something really powerful in having people be able to say, I want to go have a Latinx community center and know that we can all be together. If you're Jewish, like Alex's family, I want to be able to go to a Jewish community gathering and know that you can have solidarity and pluralism. And I think that this country at its best is a country of both and. The two things can be true at once. You can have a historically Black college and university that is proud of that tradition, that is not saying that other people are less than or less valuable. Anna Julia Cooper, who's the only woman quoted in the American Passport, who was born a slave in North Carolina and went to a HBCU, St. Aug. She had this very amazing phrase about feminism. And her feminist quote, which was the mantra of the Young Women's Christian Association for many years, is not the boys less, but the girls more. The concept is it's not that anyone who's in a power seat should have less necessarily, maybe, but that's not where we start. Where we start is let's look at the people who are traditionally marginalized and allow them to, let's make space for more. I do think that we have a lot to learn from towns like Mossville. And it's more than just what happened to their bodies in terms of the chemical plants. What they built is brilliant. And I think that there's still more to learn from that.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And I just want to be really clear that Mossville is not a story about desegregation or integration. It's a story of a Black enclave, independent, unto itself, self-determined, where the families came together and made a space that was a haven from brutal, violent, demeaning racism all around them. And lived and thrived well, because where they were was a very rich ecosystem where businesses could be built from farming and agriculture that they controlled, seafood because of the bayous that flow through the community. And so no one went without, and people were able to share and build together. And so it's not desegregation. I don't think that's would be something I would ever use in terms of trying to explain the Mossville story, but it's the way in which a Black community, just like we're seeing with the situation with the young man Ahmaud jogging, a Black man can be attacked by others with no justice, right? And so this is a community that built, thrived for generations, and then it was attacked by industrial developers, by corporations that wanted to pollute and didn't want to live, and knew that this is a place that they could do it and not have to deal with any of the consequences of that pollution, making those products. And with government support throughout the whole thing, and making environmental laws in such a way that those companies can get everything that they want and not have to limit or reduce or minimize much of anything in the exchange. That's the story of Mossville that I see is what it takes in this country to be able to be Black and to have a community of Black people, and how do you survive, and how do you defend, and how do you grow, and how do you manage that? It gets really difficult in a country like America. And I think, you know, you don't see, notwithstanding, I mean, yes, Mossville Environmental Action Now, they sued, they fought, they protested, they rallied, they always voted when they got the first opportunity to do so. But it was not enough to save themselves in this country.
So I have one last question, but I also realize that it's 12:40. So if you guys need to go, I'm happy to let you go. But maybe for Alex, quickly, one of the kind of main criticisms that I've seen was that you didn't speak with some of the higher ups at Sasol, the big company, and I was wondering if you had tried to speak with them and it didn't work out, or if it wasn't part of sort of how you envisioned the project, the story that you wanted to tell.
Well, I would say both. First of all, they did not want to go on record with us. They did not want to do an interview. They did want to constantly harass us the entire time that we were filming, and they are very close with law enforcement out there. And you know, we were constantly detained and followed and harassed, but they did not actually want to go on record in the film. And I think that is actually not the vision that we wanted. I understand that that's something that people want in documentaries, and Big Charity, we did really try hard to have both sides of the story understood and represented. I think in this story, we wanted to tell a character-driven, immersive story that brings you into our character spaces, brings you into their perspectives, and going into a corporate office with some guy in a suit reading off of a PR sheet, we all know what they're gonna say. And we decided that taking you out of Stacey's space, taking you out of Erica's world, to take you into that corporate office was unnecessary. And you know, we didn't really think that we needed to give them the time of day, because we all know exactly what they're going to say. And as Monique just said the other day, you know, Sasol is very represented in the film. Sasol is in there. We see what Sasol does. They're all around Stacey, and we see what they do in South Africa. So they are in the film even without their PR person, you know, giving their sound bites.
I'm wondering if Sasol feels that they were somehow treated unfairly. Is that what the criticism is? Where's this coming from? When I looked at the film, I saw, you know, one of the, critiques on it. I said, Sasol is in almost every scene of this documentary, and that's what Stacey is trying, when he's building that fence and his voiceover, he's trying to keep Sasol out of his life, and that fence does just so much. Sasol is there, and the person who blocks Stacey from leaving his own property. Sasol is there being interviewed and talking very enthusiastically, exuberantly about bringing their racist anti-apartheid company to America and changing America, or at least Mossville, to be just like what they built in South Africa. And then you see what that looks like in South Africa, and you see how this company is born out of maintaining apartheid after other countries were setting embargoes on South Africa to change it, to dismantle it. This company was there to keep the lights on for racism. So for someone who wants to hear more from that, I don't know what that would look like, but their voice is pretty loud and clear throughout all of this.
All right, thank you guys so much. On that note, I appreciate all of you taking the time to speak with us today, and I look forward to seeing you in whatever works you do next. We really appreciate everything you're doing.
Thank you. I just would love to invite people to follow us on Facebook. Yes. And we're so excited about this virtual theatrical run, and to kick it off with Maysles is just such a gift to us. We want to thank Maysles for doing something so innovative as this. And we want to encourage everyone to support your local theaters like Maysles. We need for these theaters to continue to exist so that we can connect with stories like Mossville. We'll also be on the Real South at PBS. Check that out. And then we're also very, very humbled and honored that the UN at Geneva is going to use the film as a tool to tell a larger story about environmental racism and people of African descent. So thank you all for your support.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Take care, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Stay healthy and safe.
You too.
Bye.